We're recording. Will you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Metzidakis, professor of French and Comparative Literature at Washington University.
All right. I would like to ask you a few questions. The first question would be, if you can discuss the first time you encountered unrest in high school in the 60s.
I was the student council president of my senior class, and this was 1969, 1970, and I remembered racial riots breaking out in Springfield, Massachusetts, where I grew up. And in particular, I remember it all starting with a food fight in our school cafeteria, which was a very large cafeteria in a very large high school, with something like 850 people in my class. And I'll never forget seeing huge trash cans being picked up by one group being thrown at another group, and the groups being racially characterized. So I had a lot of black friends over there and white friends over here, and some of the people over there were actually teammates of mine on the wrestling team and really good friends of mine. So it was a really disturbing situation. Needless to say, I wasn't throwing anything, but I couldn't believe the sort of raw emotions that were being displayed by both sides at that point. And so part of my job as a student council president was to try to calm it down. So we then afterwards had meetings and assemblies and all kinds of things to try to keep things tame within the school. But what was happening in my school was not unique to my school, and there were other things like that happening in other local high schools. And so not too much later, the same kinds of riots, if you want to call them that, they weren't, that deadly or anything, but there were bad scenes like that were repeated then in the streets in Springfield, Massachusetts, in some of the poorer neighborhoods in particular. So there too, I remember going just out of curiosity to see who was there, what was going on, and a lot of people would show up just to witness what was happening. And there again, I saw some very ugly exchanges between blacks and whites in particular. And
hold on one second. I think I'm gonna have to close the window.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I don't know why they do that. People teach here, and
I know.
always.
Okay. Okay, you said you were talking about specifically in the poor neighborhoods
Right.
in Massachusetts. Okay, go ahead.
So yeah, there were some neighborhoods in particular, not too far from the school, or the schools, because all the high schools in Springfield, Mass, are pretty much in the same downtown area. And some of these riots then occurred about, I would say, within a mile of those different school places. And they continued not just that day but several weeks after these initial events took place. And I don't think anybody was killed, but there were a lot of people who were actually injured. People started throwing stones and heavy objects that actually did do some damage to some property as well, and hurt some people. So it wasn't like what was happening in Detroit or Los Angeles or places like that, but there was enough ugliness to know that you were involved in a kind of national situation that had implications for everybody living in the States at the time.
Was there an event that stands out that may have impacted your life to become Dr. Metzidakis?
You mean from this time
From
period?
this time, something that may have said, okay, I want to make a difference.
Yeah, I think that, just seeing how much misunderstanding was occurring and how much kind of irrational fear of the other was occurring, I think that I was probably prompted even more than I had been before, because I kind of always knew I wanted to be a professor thanks to my uncle, who was a professor and whose lifestyle was one that I thought I would like to imitate down the road. I was certainly prompted by these events to try to do something that would involve communicating more with people, especially other cultures, in other languages, etc. And since I had already come from a kind of dual background, having been brought up in the United States, but pretty much in a totally Greek-speaking environment. My mother, for instance, didn't speak English when I was born, so my mother tongue is literally Greek. And so I went to Greek school, and all kinds of everything I was doing up until the age I went to college was connected somehow in one way or another to the Greek church and to the Greek community of Springfield. So I'd really kind of had a long-term interest in translation and in cooperation and in interacting with people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultures. And I think that just was reinforced by what I was seeing then happening all around me in the United States, where clearly there was a kind of social, that cultural revolution that was occurring at that time in the late 60s.
Okay. What role did you play in your college years related to the movement? Because by this time, the Black Studies departments were established.
Mm-hmm.
What did you see? How did you participate?
Well, let me think. There was one instance I remember actually specifically having to do with this kind of civil rights issue, and that was a debate. It was, I can't remember the name, but I'm sure your audience is going to know, you may know too. It was Roy Innis. There was somebody who was debating I think it was a social scientist who basically claimed that he had found out evidence that blacks were genetically inferior in terms of their intellectual capacities to whites. And this was something that was actually being advanced seriously by this social scientist. I'm sure one could find this easily in looking up what was happening in 1972, 73. It was right around then that I remember this big debate occurring on campus. And I do remember walking by it. I didn't go to it. I think I had class or something that day or that evening. But there was a big demonstration in the front, especially the African American students who were up in arms, and there were a lot of whites also who were joining them. I kind of joined in because I thought it was an outrageous thing to say also. But again, I didn't follow it that much, so I don't know all the specifics. But that was certainly a big event on campus, and this was on a campus that had already gone through a lot of turmoil because of the Vietnam War in particular. When I got to college in 1970, I'd mentioned this to you before, they had actually burned down one of the buildings on campus in response to the bombing of Cambodia in May of 1970. So I entered college in September of 1970, and they were sort of right at the time that there was still this great social unrest and political activism against the war. So really everything was happening at the same time. I mean, there was the protest against the war, there was civil rights, there was feminist issues. I remember when I was a freshman, for instance, there was a campaign because my class was the very first class to admit full-time female undergraduates to Princeton. And so there was actually a movement on campus, I'll never forget it, really within the first few months I was there, a kind of right-wing demonstration against the admission of women to campus. And I remember it was called Bring Back the Old Princeton. I remember guys walking around with signs saying, bring back the old Princeton. Well, the old Princeton I didn't know because I was just brand new there. But, I looked around at some of my female classmates and thought, this is a pretty ridiculous thing to be doing. But it was part and parcel of what was happening at the time. I mean, everything that you can imagine that you can think of now in terms of identity politics, ethnic studies, cultural studies programs, different programs for different groups, all of those things were just emerging, just being demanded. And so there really wasn't a day or a week that went by, especially in the early 70s like that, when I was first a freshman and then a sophomore, where there wasn't something going on in the streets, on campus, some sort of gathering And it's that very same kind of activism that I haven't seen in this country, really since then. There's been nothing like that. That's why I persist in thinking that it was a genuine cultural revolution that we were living through at that point. I don't know if something like that might possibly happen now, given similar kinds of, at least, economic problems. There weren't so many economic problems, really, at the end of the 60s, except for, for minorities, who, of course, were in terrible shape. And so I guess you could argue that what's happening now, not just with minorities, but with sort of lower income people in America today, there are some similarities that one might point to there, which might, I believe, lead to some kind of activism that we haven't seen for a while.
Okay. All right, the next question is, specifically speaking about the Black Arts Movement, do you remember any type of events going on at Princeton or a buzz about this movement during that time?
The people I remembered most, my wife is a big jazz aficionada, and she was heavily into the jazz scene from the late 50s really on, because my wife's older than I am. She kind of turned me on to jazz later, but I remember getting into the blues in particular. I mean, the blues in general are still my favorite music. And I remembered, of course, that rock and roll at the end of the 60s was heavily blues influenced. And I didn't really understand that fully at that point. I didn't realize how much Eric Clapton and, Led Zeppelin and groups like this owed to earlier black blues singers. I learned that afterward. Or even Elvis Presley. I mean, you think about the whole history of rock and roll. Of course, we know now, we whites in particular, we know that now in a way we never, I think, fully understood it then. But in any case, I guess it's then the jazz connection more than anything that I related to the black experience of the time, because I was interested in kind of advanced rock and roll, if you want to call it that, groups like the Moody Blues and Yes, and groups that were sort of pushing the edge of rock and roll, and then jazz fusion, which was really just emerging, really caught my attention. Groups like Return to Forever, we had Stanley Jordan as the bassist in there, and Miles Davis, of course, when he did something like Bitches Brew. An album like that was something that we listened to nonstop, and so I started realizing how at least jazz was connected or connecting at the time more and more with rock and roll, with more popular kind of music like that was more mainstream music. And I was definitely attracted to that a great deal. I never liked certain sort of basic rock and roll stuff, and so jazz had a kind of natural attraction for me. And then again, I realized that a lot of my favorite so-called rock and roll people were heavily influenced by jazz. I mean, I think even of like the Grateful Dead, who I used to listen to a lot, and Jerry Garcia, who was one of the great so-called rock and roll guitarist, as it turns out, was an incredibly good jazz guitarist who had a tremendous knowledge in jazz. So I think that if I can find a particular connection to black culture that attracted me then, it would be that mainly in that musical area.
Okay. Do you feel that as you learn more about jazz and you experience more about it, do you feel that the times affected jazz and it started to change its face?
Yeah, I do think that's true. My wife, who again is a great lover of classic jazz, did not like what was happening to jazz at that point. She thought it was somehow selling out or becoming more mainstream, and it was no longer than just about something more abstract, which she liked. I, on the other hand, coming from it, from the point of total ignorance, I found that really kind of refreshing, and I liked that. So I do think it was connected. That the emergence of fusion, for instance, was definitely connected to groups that normally were apart coming together. The blacks and whites, for instance, just collaborating more. I mean, when you think of Bitches Brew, you realize how many kinds of people are playing on that album. I mean, you have John McLaughlin playing on that album, as well as and Wayne Shorter. I mean, you have a really interesting mixture of people, and I think that certainly did happen in the past. I mean, there were great white jazz musicians all along, but not very many, I would say. Not far. They were far more in the minority. But I think that as time went on, and as people both fought and then started to understand one another more, there was probably a mixing of people that had never occurred perhaps to that same extent before, and that was something that I can say I noticed. It was all part of the same general ethos of the time.
Yes. I remember the last time I was in here, you were speaking of, I think it was a white flight.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, the white flight I can speak to very directly. I mean, that's a general phenomenon of demographics. Most American cities before the 60s had the greatest concentration of people, of their population, downtown, within the cities. I mean, but after all these riots and all this unrest and all this, all these disturbances that we're talking about here in the late 60s, a lot of the white population, which of course typically was better off materially, got scared. It was a pure question of fear and of racism in some cases, not wanting blacks to come into their community, and not wanting to damage their community, and so therefore, what was their alternative? What was their option? Well, to run away, and that's essentially what happened. You had cities that were basically emptying out and flocking to the suburbs. So suburbs, which of course had already been developing after World War II, they were already, sprawling, but they started sprawling even more, one might say, as a result of what happened in the 60s. My own family, for instance, stayed in the city of Springfield for a long time, but it's not an accident that my older brother, who still lives in the area, now lives in a small suburb called East Long Meadow outside of Springfield. And most of the people I grew up with now live around the city of Springfield rather than in the city. Now, of course, things are finally changing and people are starting to move back into the city. But for, I would say, good 2 decades anyway, so the 70s and the 80s, were all about this white flight to the suburbs. You see that, of course, here in St. Louis, and a lot of that still hasn't changed. I mean, the growth of West County here, it has to be attributed to that to a great extent. I'm not an urban planner, and I'm not a historian per se or a political scientist, but if you have eyes, you can see that. Yes. And you can also see that in St. Louis there are still gated communities, there are still private neighborhoods that have gates on them, and it's supposedly to sort of keep a certain kind of calm or lack of traffic, but I don't think it's an accident that some of these places are located in places that are thought of as kind of limiting places, between one section of town and another, one part of the city and another. And I'm afraid to say that I still see a great deal of that kind of segregation, even now, and I've been in St. Louis for almost 30 years now, since '82. I'll never forget coming here, for instance, hearing from several white friends or acquaintances about certain places I should not go. For instance, do not go past X, Y, or Z street. I used to hear such things, of course, in New York City when I was at Columbia doing my graduate work about Harlem, which is right next door to Columbia. I find it very funny, for instance, that just the other day I was walking on 125th Street and walked right in front of the Apollo Theater and thought, I lived in this neighborhood for 5 years back in the 70s and never came here, I said to myself, because I would have been the only white person there. And so it was that kind of segregation that, of course, that has changed mercifully for all of us. I think that's a lot of that has gone away, but it still exists in some places, and for some of the same reasons.
That's interesting. Now we'll move to the present day, to the university. Do you believe that multicultural presence should be celebrated and incorporated in the fabric of the curriculum in the department and university campuses?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have been accused by some over the years of being more conservative in this regard than I should be, because I wrote a book once on difference, which some people saw as a kind of attack on the idea of difference, which it wasn't. It was simply a questioning, kind of an examination of whether difference and everything that's connected to difference, like pluralism, multiculturalism, etc., whether or not those things are by definition good for the world. And I pretty much always have said and written and believed and taught that that of course multiculturalism, that difference and pluralism are all very good things. I'm a great supporter of them, and in a way I'm a living example of their importance, because I married a woman who is, for instance, not only different in age, but she's of a different Christian background from mine, a totally different ethnicity from mine, and so it's not like I have any problem with such differences. So I think that it's a really good thing to celebrate our differences, to celebrate multiculturalism, and to try to use our differences in these positive ways. I think the only problem I have with it, however, with that whole notion, is that sometimes there may be an important choice to be made between including certain texts, for instance, certain cultural products, and others. And at that point, I think one has to ask perhaps more profound questions than are sometimes asked when it comes to including or not including one thing over something else. And I mean, there we could get into a debate about, the Western canon and all kinds of other issues, which of course we don't have time to get into. But I do think, for instance, that there have been some instances where there's been such an emphasis on including those writers, those artists, those musicians who were not included in the past. There's been such a push to include some of them that sometimes we've pushed out other people who I think are equally important, if not more important, historically speaking, so that our young people a lot of times don't realize that what they are now celebrating, in fact, isn't as new, for instance, isn't as original as that a lot of people think. That they're sometimes amazed to know that, person X, Y, or Z isn't the first one to have discussed these things, even within, say, African American literature. I mean, if you go back to, Booker T. Washington, or any number of people, Frederick Douglass, I mean, and read what they, or Du Bois, I mean, if you read stuff that was written before the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, you realize, wait a minute, a lot of this stuff was covered, was evoked, was developed, was announced, was predicted by people a long time ago. So I think that if there is a downside to stressing, difference itself nowadays, it's that sometimes we stress modern difference. It's more a temporal thing. It's more a historical thing, a time-related thing. In other words, we tend to stress more what's happening right now over what happened in the past. And when that happens, I think there's a problem, whether it's multicultural or not. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably my biggest reservation about multiculturalism, that sometimes we're just in a rush to privilege something that's happening right now because it's different from something else that's happening right now. Mm-hmm. And yet I don't think that's necessarily the best criterion to use to evaluate the worth of something, whether in the university or in our culture at large.
So how do you feel as far as courses that are focused on a certain subject? Say, for instance, Irish literature.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that a professor needs to also incorporate other literature that may have been, I don't know, affected by this particular author that happens to be Irish? And just,
Sure. Sure.
So how do you feel about that?
In my case, the more relevant example would have to do with so-called francophone literature. In other words, literature that's written in French, but that isn't from France. So this would include, Creole literature. It would include West African, French-speaking literature, Vietnamese literature, Quebecois literature, Acadian literature, Cajun literature, and art and culture, and so. Of course, I think that all that's really important, rather than to stress only what is thought of as pure French, for instance. I think it's really important for us, and in fact the whole profession thinks it's really important for us to start studying all of those other variants, one might call them, or other versions of this dominant, hegemonic, culture that was always associated just with mainland France, the hexagon as it's called. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to show how much influence that primary culture and language has had, but at the same time to recognize and celebrate the many achievements of all of its other kind of parts. So francophone literature and culture is both of those things are in fact really important to the study of anything having to do with France, because it's in fact part of the same continuum. So yeah, that would be true then about anything Irish or anything English. I mean, you think about English novelists in India or in Egypt, people writing in English. It's the same phenomenon the world over. You have a kind of historically dominant place, nation, and culture, and then all the things that are then connected to it, which of course in many cases involve previous colonies, and that's a whole other issue whether or not colonization was a good thing or not. But certainly colonization explains why there are these other variants of the dominant culture.
Okay. Let's go on to. Do you feel that going back to around in the 70s, where there were a lot of the movements that were going on, and a lot of people made a lot of promises as far as the university of how we're going to continue to keep this alive and to help everyone. In my research right here on WashU's campus, they have the John Whiteley papers, he was in charge of being like the liaison between the Chancellor Elliott and the African American students on campus. And so I just want to know, how do you feel those goals, have they been kept, or have they been pushed aside? Because nowadays, for sure that the students, they don't really have a desire to know about their own WashU culture. I mean, their own WashU history. And I just want to know how you feel.
Well, I think a lot of the dreams of the people in the late 60s have been realized. That is the creation of, African American departments and programs, for instance. Gay rights sort of gave rise to gay studies, queer studies. So in other words, a lot of these identity-based groups and segments of society who were asking to be included and to be recognized more and more within the university structure, I think have received, they've sort of found their place in the sun, as it were. No doubt for some people not nearly as much as they would like, no doubt for others too much, but the fact is that the university nowadays looks a lot different, and the university curriculum in particular now looks a lot different from the way it did when I entered college in 1970. So I think that that's a good thing, and I think that it does represent a kind of progress. Again, depending on your point of view, it may not be enough progress, or maybe too much progress, but no, I think it's incontestable that things have changed. The phenomenon you're referring to about maybe young African Americans not being interested? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah,
in
both,
their own,
actually,
perhaps in their own history.
all cultures.
I think what happens is that almost when such things succeed, they end up in a sense failing, because they succeed. Their goal is to be assimilated, is to be recognized. But at a certain point, when they actually become assimilated into the larger group, the larger society, the curriculum, whatever it might be, then in a sense they lose their luster, they lose their special nature, their their thirst for recognition, if you might call it that, their desire to be recognized. Once they're recognized, in a sense, is left hanging. They don't know what more to do or say, so that the people who come next, beyond them, after them, don't recognize what has changed. And for them, it's a new reality, which is simply their reality, and they don't have to respond the same way. I mean, I think of this most obviously in the case of feminism, because we have 2 children, and our older child is a girl who's now 29, and my wife and I always marvel at how she takes for granted so many of the things that feminist movements at the end of the 60s and early 70s fought for. Not just equal rights, which apparently are still not officially the law of the land, but let's say there too that there's been a lot of progress on a lot of those fronts. And a lot of young girls now just don't understand how different not just their parents' lives were, their mothers or their grandmothers, but entire generations of women going all the way back to the beginning of human history, so that they have no idea how recent a phenomenon it is that they have the kinds of freedoms, the kind of even more or less equal roles and equal treatments that they receive in society. They don't realize how really new all that stuff is. And so I think that's I wouldn't call that sad or tragic, but it is eye-opening for anybody who's been around long enough to realize how far that situation for women has come from even the mid 20th century to now. So if you want to go back further, then of course it looks even more dramatic.
That's it. It's so interesting what you're saying, because it refers to Sankofa, which is, just going back and retrieving your past in order to go to the future. And how do you pass that along? Is that the job of the university, or is that where they lose it? They're so caught up in their own, discovery of themselves.
I think the university's primary mission is to pass on the best, the best that's ever been taught and read and produced in the past to the future. I think that always should be its first and primary mission. Of course, it wants to also draw attention to what is new and different and original, but again, so much of what is new and original and different, in fact, has a history that if you don't look backward first and foremost, then you can never understand what's happening now, nor, I dare say, see where it's going in the future. I mean, you think of the National Archives in D.C., on whose walls you read "Past is prologue," and that's the whole idea. It's a prologue. The past is the prologue for the book that's now being written. Wow. That's the book that's going to be written. So, if a university doesn't see its primary role as one of preservation, conservation, and transmission of the great values and great cultural works of the past, then I don't know what its mission could be. That's got to be its first mission. After that, there are several other missions. As I said, stressing and emphasizing new things and new developments and inventions and discoveries and new realizations about social networks and social groups and all that. But I don't see even there how you can fully appreciate the newness of something, the novelty of something, without having a good historical consciousness and a good awareness of what was there first. So that's why I would say that should always be the university's primary mission.
Could you tell me about the Greek turn on Sankofa? Your information on that?
Oh yeah, well that's yeah. When you told me the title of your play, I immediately thought you were referring to Syncopation, which is a musical notion that has to do with the term syncope, which is from ancient Greek, and has to do with stresses and accents in it both in first in poetry and then in music, so that anybody I think who's a jazz aficionado is going to certainly know a lot about syncopation. And lots of other musical forms, of course, use syncopation. It's where you have certain beats that are suddenly stressed in a sequence that is not stressed, and that there are lots of examples of that, not just in jazz, but in scat singing and rap is full of such things. So so hip hop culture has a direct connection to this notion of syncopation, it seems to me. So I think it's a happy coincidence, as I said to you before, that your title evokes, for those people interested in music, that side of things, as well as what it evokes for your particular set of interests in this play.
Can you tell me about the Greek take on Sankofa from history?
Well, just what I said. This notion of syncope, which has to do with ancient Greek poetry. It's a question of syllables and what syllables are accented over which other ones. It has to do with the kind of the earliest rules of what are called versification or prosody, which affect all forms of poetry, from antiquity to the present. And so, again, I think that your word, which apparently is, you said it was an African word?
A Khan tribe.
Khan word?
Yes.
Okay. Then it just happens to be a wonderful coincidence that it also refers in English and in other languages that derive from some of their languages, from some of their words from Greek. It's a wonderful coincidence that it should also have this other meaning for your audience. So,
can you tell me about the Greek god that had the two?
Yeah. The god Janus. Yeah, that's not a Greek god. It's a Roman god.
Roman.
But Janus is the two-faced god who looks both forward and backward.
Okay. Can you start again, because I got it wrong? So
Sure. Okay. So yes, you ask about the god Janus, who is the Roman god, a two-faced god who looks both forward and backward. You see him sometimes in iconography, both in the cinema and elsewhere, where you see this figure of two faces looking this way and that way. I know most recently there's something called Janus films that has to do with some of the great classic cinema of the 20th century. Somebody like Bergman, for instance, his films are often produced by, or at least reproduced by, Janus films. And the interest of this god is that he looks both forward and backward, in other words, towards the future as well as the past. And it's from this name Janus that we get the name for the month of January, which of course is the first month of the year, which looks forward, but because it's the first month of the year, it's also it represents the month that's closest to the previous year. So it has this sort of dual facet to it, and dual function to stress how important it is to look forward and backward at the same time.
Okay, just two more questions. Can you speak a little bit about Humboldt, his theory, and how you feel is important and relevant to today's university?
Well, a Humboldtian idea of the university is still quite pertinent to what we do today. A lot of his principles, like the autonomy of the university, where it basically runs itself, is a really important notion. It's the only way the university can protect itself from outside political, economic, and social influences, which of course do still exist and do still exert a certain amount of power on what goes on within the university. But at least in the ideal, in the abstract, this notion of autonomy can be traced back to Humboldt, and that's an important ongoing principle that allows people to teach what they want, talk about what they want, research what they want, and do it in a kind of way that doesn't necessarily menace them, either in their livelihood or just in their everyday life. So that's one big idea of Humboldt. The other is the notion of doing pure research, that the university would be a place where scholars would be free to study whatever they want, to explore things just for the sake of exploring things, without necessarily thinking of the immediate utilitarian value of that study or of that research project. This, of course, is a great thing in a university because there's no other place where people can do that. Usually in the world, in everyday life, people do what they do because it brings them money. It has a material, an immediate material benefit to it. Whereas in a university, a lot of what's done is done so that something down the road might become useful, or might be of interest, or just of value, some sort of an intangible value to the people doing it, or to the students of the people doing it. And so that notion of pure research is Humboldtian, as another really important part of his legacy to the university. Those are the two big things. And probably the last thing then would be the relationship between the teacher and the student, where Humboldt really made a big deal, I think, out of the idea that students should be able to look up to their professors, and not look up in the sense of, servants to their masters, but look up in the way that they would like to emulate their professors. So there's a sort of ethical and moral as well as intellectual component to the Humboldtian idea of education that continues to work, in the modern university. So that people now, I think, continue to strive anyway to be role models in every possible way. I mean, it's not a question of doing that blindly or naively, because of course not everybody's perfect, and nobody who is a certain way can necessarily serve as a role model in every possible way to somebody else. But the idea that a professor should at least live his or her life and speak of things and do things in his or her research that could be of tremendous interest to their students, and to do it in such a way as to make them feel part of the project, I think continues to be a lasting legacy of Humboldt. So that what we have in American universities now is this insistence on a very close relationship between professor as mentor and student as, kind of colleague and friend of teacher, which didn't exist very much in the past, and still in many places outside of the West, usually in poorer places or more traditional societies, let's say, still doesn't exist. There isn't the same sort of give and take, the exchange, the free exchange of ideas that I think Humboldt was fully aware was possible and was also desirable. So that's probably the last of his main points that needs to be stressed.
Okay, all right. And just last thing, will you speak to, say for instance, all this is going to pass away, and this is going in a time capsule. What would your advice be to the future student? What would you like them to know to be better at?
My number one thing for any future student is to say that they should all learn history. The history is the most important single thing to know. If you don't know the past, again, you don't know anything about the present, or not likely to know much about the future. So if you don't study history, you're losing so much of what makes us who we are and makes the world what it is. So that's the first thing I would stress. Just forever raising one's historical awareness and consciousness. then after that, I would also perhaps stress certain subjects, like geography, things that seem to be left aside more and more in the world, and that I think also help us understand our world and our place in it in ways that people seem to have forgotten. So I guess the main point would be to sort of let's go back, even in this regard. Let's go backwards and see what was studied, what used to be studied, and let's figure out whether or not some of those things from the past that we may have pushed aside or underestimated and undervalued might not in fact be useful to us now and forever, so that it's not a question of always wanting to reinvent the wheel every time we start another school year or open a new school or take a new course, but what is it that we can gain from what's already there and then work with that to find something new, rather than going the other way around. In other words, starting with everything as if it's a startling new discovery and then realizing after the fact that no, in fact, this stuff has been around and perhaps even in a better form, at some other time and in some other place. So all of that would be what I'd say for students to learn.
Okay, and if you wouldn't mind, I would just like you to introduce yourself, look right in the camera, and tell them welcome to Sankofa.
Hi, I'm Metzidakis, a professor of French and Comparative Literature at Washington University, and I welcome you to Sankofa.
All right, thank you.